Hi, this video is about the basics of making a good composition in artwork. So the first thing to consider is the format of your paper, so the shape of your paper. Is it going to be rectangular, or is it going to be more square? Is it going to be vertical or horizontal? Is it going to be skinny, or is it going to be fat? So once you have the format, you know what shape it's going to be, you're going to plan your composition. And composition just means the arrangement on the page. So literally where you're going to put things so that it flows and looks like a good piece of art, and then it makes sense and it's kind of cohesive. And then you're going to figure out where you're going to put the focal point. So one way to do that is by using the rule of thirds grid. You're going to place your focal point in an area where they intersect. So you're going to divide the page visually. You don't necessarily need to measure. Just divide it into thirds. And those areas where they intersect is the important part of where you want the focal point to be. So you don't want to put the focal point right in the middle. You don't want it to just be along the edge. You don't want it to be going off the edge as far as the corner goes. Else it's drawing your eye off the page. So our goal is to keep the viewer interested in looking at the entire thing. And so if you think back to movies, when they do an action shot and it's just a kind of a close-up of a face, their heads are generally on one side or the other. And so they're considering the rule of thirds when framing that shot. So here's a good example of a portrait within a photograph or a video. And then sometimes they've even zoomed in a little bit more and have cropped off the top of the head. And here's another good shot. It's a photograph, but of using the rule of thirds grid. So notice how the horizon line and the sand line are falling along the axis, the rule of thirds. So one of those lines. You want to make sure that you do not divide the page in half. So you do not want to put the horizon line here right in the middle of the page. You also want to make sure that you don't divide the page in half vertically. And so with this, we have the boat kind of in our rule of thirds, right? It's in the right spot here. And then it's not a horizontal boat so that it's dividing the page in half. So if the boat were turned so that it looked more like this kind of the boat, that would not be okay because it's right in the center of the picture, and it divides it in half and it breaks up the space awkwardly, and it makes it almost kind of too symmetrical, and our eye naturally finds it unpleasant. So in this picture of poorly drawn mountains, again we have the horizon line in the very center, dividing the page in half. So that's something you do not want to do. So the other thing that you don't want to do is divide anything diagonally. So whether that's you've got a whole bunch of stuff here and then the negative space is all of this up here, you end up dividing the page diagonally too, which is not good. So you want to make sure you remember that, not to divide it up like that. And then the other thing is that you don't want to put an object right in the center. So you don't want to put the rose right in the middle of the page, or the flower or whatever, whether it's that or a stool or some sort of object. You want to make sure that it's not centered like that, because again, there's nowhere for your eye to travel to. So in this picture, we have the flower right in the very center, and sometimes with flowers it might be okay because it can be more of a radial object. So there's obviously rules that can be broken, but in this case, I'm trying to teach you about cropping and getting creative with how you arrange things on the page for a good composition. So we have a flower. The black space, the negative space, it's not very interesting. There's just this whole big lot of it here, and there's one tiny little area that is a little bit more interesting. So something that would be a better choice would be to crop it down. So what that means is to literally crop the edge of the paper. So ideally draw it bigger so that you wouldn't have to cut the paper itself, so that we now have the new negative space, which I've talked about when talking about positive and negative space. We have these really cool, interesting shapes. So this one, in my opinion, is a much more interesting composition. We've followed the rules of thirds. We know exactly where the focal point is. It's kind of in this area here. It draws our eye this way, but then still allows it to come back in. So we still have this, the green leaf here really helps draw our eye back into the flower and allows it to feel more complete. We also have some really good negative space with the way that it's cropped. Right, so that's cropped down here at the bottom. So this all becomes one big piece. We have lots of little pieces within this. So you want to make sure that when you crop it, that it goes off the edges of the paper, the size of the paper, and that they're each interesting. They're not all exactly the same. And then to also, something that's important is to use an odd number of objects for grouping. So if you have few enough for your eye to quickly count, like 5 or less, then you want to do 1, 3, or 5. But if it's more than, let's say, 5 or 7, it's really not that noticeable, so you don't need to worry about that. So in this example, there are 3 flowers as opposed to just 2, and it's, even though it's not cropped super great, it's much more interesting just because there's 3. There's an odd number. So next thing to keep in mind is to vary the baseline of the objects at both the top and the bottom of the composition. So whether you're doing a still life like this or something that includes people or buildings or anything like that, that you vary it and make it different. So the baseline is here, and then the top of them are here. And so you want to have varying heights just to make it more engaging for the viewer and to make it more appealing. If everything was always on the same plane, then it would be very boring. So you want to change up the height of each object. And the final thing is to create the illusion of space. So with the foreground, middle ground, and background. So we've talked about positive and negative space, but this means depth and distance. So front, middle ground, and background. Foreground, middle ground, background. So here, the objects that are in the front, obviously, is this green box. It's lower on the page, right? It's the lowest line. The middle ground is the blue line, so it literally comes up a little bit higher. And then in the background are the yellow and green boxes because they are literally higher on the page. So in order to create that depth and distance, you make the baselines go higher up the further they get. And in this yummy example, we have the foreground is the cookie itself, right? Then the middle ground is the plate of cookies, so a little higher up. And in the background, we have the bowl of maybe milk to dip the cookies in. And so literally it starts from low down here at the bottom, gets a little higher, and then a little higher to show you the foreground, the middle ground, and then the background. You also want to pay attention to overlapping. And so making sure that the things in the front overlap the things in the middle and the background. It's not the other way around. So to recap all of this and to summarize everything, first you take in consideration the format, the shape of your paper. Second is to plan it out. So you're going to use the rule of thirds. You're not going to divide the page in half in any direction. You're going to make sure you crop your image so that they go off the sides of the paper to break up that negative space. You want to use odd numbers. You want to vary the baselines of your objects. And then you're going to create the illusion of space and depth. So that's it for creating a good composition and the basics of that. Once you know the rules, then you can go and break them.